Chapter 2, The Appeal of Third World Marxism. Intertwined with the growing appeal of revolutionary ideas was Marxism's rise to ideological hegemony on the left, and among the various traditions within Marxism, a version of Leninism identified with Third World movements, especially the Chinese, Cuban, and Vietnamese Communist parties, gained the largest following. Third World Marxism was such a strong pole of attraction that it influenced every trend on the left. It made its mark on radical and socialist feminism and even had an effect on the radical reform current, left liberalism, that emerged in and around the Democratic Party, but its main appeal was to those who sought a framework for social revolution that put the anti-imperialist and anti-racist upsurges of that era at its very center. This included not just the wave of young activists of all backgrounds who decided to define themselves primarily as Marxists and Marxist-Leninists, but militants in communities of color who had adopted a critique of capitalism and characterized themselves as revolutionary nationalists. Indeed, for several years after 1968, the Third World-oriented Marxist and revolutionary nationalist currents developed in tandem and interpenetrated to such an extent that the boundaries between them were quite unclear. This situation was the product of particular historical circumstances, in contrast to the other periods when Marxism and socialism gained significant influence in the United States 1900-1920 and the 1930s. National liberation movements, many but not all communist-led, were playing a more prominent role in the struggle against world capitalism than either working-class movements in the capitalist heartlands or socialist countries. Thus the period was both a Marxist moment and a nationalist moment. And despite the distinction in theory between working-class internationalism and ultimately bourgeois nationalism, in the concrete it was not easy, especially for newly radicalized youth, to distinguish between a Marxist project in which national liberation for the moment played the pivotal role and a nationalist project that utilized important elements of socialist theory or rhetoric. In other periods of U.S. history, the relationship of Marxism to nationalist movements in communities of color has been quite different, and nationalism has taken less progressive forms. But at the end of the 1960s, the version of working-class ideology being embraced by a new generation of aspiring Marxists was heavily influenced by nationalism, and simultaneously a Marxist-influenced revolutionary nationalism was achieving unprecedented influence within broader nationalist circles. All this would have been impossible without a major leap in the influence of Marxism between the early and late 1960s. The remainder of this chapter will examine the general social and political factors that accounted for that rise, and Chapter 3 will detail the way the process unfolded as the movement developed an organizational expression, an imperial power. Marxism's high standing in the late 1960s marked a striking shift from the early part of the decade. The contrast was most evident in the pyramid-eating organizations of the early New Left, SNCC and SDS. Both had their origins in non-Marxist political currents. Especially important in their formation was a mix of religious ideology, humanist liberalism, and social democracy. Even as both became more radical through the mid-1960s, they did not adopt a Marxist framework, though individuals in both organizations advocated Marxist views, and in SNCC some of the most vocal advocates of nationalism were simultaneously the most bitterly opposed to Marxism. Both SNCC and SDS especially shunned Marxism's emphasis on the centrality of the working class and the need for a working class-based political party. In both organizations and in New Left circles more broadly, the dominant view of Marxism and Marxist parties was that they were old, stuffy, and mired in irrelevant controversies from the 1930s, that they offered few insights into the crucial issues of race, culture, morality, or for those pioneers then concerned about sexism, gender, and that they devalued direct action and participatory democracy in favor of hierarchy and top-down leadership. Through the early and mid-1960s, scattered individuals, journals, and old left parties chipped away at these assessments, but only after 1968, in response to political earthquakes that revealed to millions just how deep the roots of U.S. militarism and racism actually were, did Marxism spread widely among 60s activists. Washington's stubborn continuation of the war in Vietnam was a prime factor in this ideological shift. Despite massive protest at home, international isolation, growing economic difficulties, and after Tet, overwhelming evidence that victory was impossible, the U.S. refused to withdraw. Something beyond a single misguided policy simply had to be operating. Young activists increasingly identified that something as the drive of an imperial system to defend its worldwide sphere of influence. A poll among college students taken in April 1970, even before Nixon invaded Cambodia, showed a staggering 41% agreeing with the statement the war in Vietnam is pure imperialism. Vietnam prodded activists to examine U.S. foreign policy more generally. They didn't have to look very far to discover that Washington had a long and sordid history of military interventions and CIA-organized coups throughout the Third World, or that foreign investment was a major source of profit for U.S. corporations and banks. The U.S.-sponsored 1954 coup in Guatemala, which directly benefited United Fruit, ongoing support for apartheid in South Africa, the deployment of Marines to the Dominican Republic in 1965, and the CIA to Uruguay in the late 1960s, all these seemed part of a pattern. Marxism argued that its roots lay the economic imperatives of capitalism, and that explanation made sense. Thus, the critique of U.S. policy in the Third World became the entryway to Marxism for thousands of young radicals. This is one of the key reasons why there was so much sympathy for the Leninist tradition on the part of the 1968 generation. Of all the traditions within Marxism, it was Leninism that placed the most emphasis on the imperialist nature of 20th-century capitalism, on the revolutionary potential of national liberation struggles, on the legitimacy of armed struggle, and on the primacy of building solidarity with oppressed peoples. Indeed, though what has come to be called Leninism encompasses a complex set of theoretical and strategic propositions, for late 60s young radicals the definition of Leninism boiled down to Th's viewpoints, plus the need for a tight revolutionary party, a violent revolution, and a dismantling of the capitalist state. The appeal of Leninism wasn't just a matter of theory. The more young radicals learned about the Leninist tradition, the more it resonated with their own experience. Communism as a separate wing of the socialist movement originated in the split in world socialism that accompanied World War I and the Russian Revolution. It emerged when a sector of the movement broke decisively with those socialists who supported the war, or at least did little or nothing to oppose it. Late 60s activists felt a powerful political and emotional bond with this legacy. They too had faced ostracism and worse for forcefully opposing the war in Vietnam and refusing to bow to fierce pressures to remain patriotic. Like the communists of 1914-19, they too had spent years in frustrating fights with more prestigious left forces that had dragged their feet, or worse, in the anti-war campaign. Though today's democratic socialists don't talk about it much, most U.S. social democrats played a sluggish or even backward role in the anti-Vietnam War movement. SD's parent organization, the League for Industrial Democracy, played a major role in the red baiting campaign against the pivotal SDS-sponsored anti-Vietnam War march in April 1965. The Socialist Party, the official U.S. affiliate of the Socialist International, was hostage to a faction within it that actually supported the war, and except for an energetic Debs caucus anchored by the tireless pacifist David McReynolds, was all but completely absent from anti-war activity. Especially consequential was the muted stance taken by Michael Harrington, speech heir after 1968 and arguably the best-known social democrat in the country since the publication of his book, The Other America, Poverty in the United States, in 1962. Harrington was personally opposed to the war, for which he caught flack from the SP's right wing. But as pointed out by his sympathetic biographer Maurice Isserman, others especially at the time were far less charitable. Harrington always held back. Michael did not allow himself to issue the kind of passionate and uncompromising moral condemnation of the Vietnam War so evident in Martin Luther King's speech. Time and again throughout the 1960s he would refer to the war as a tragedy, as if it were an earthquake, a hurricane, or a plague. He could never bring himself to say that the evils of the war were the product of human agency. It was as if the war had been set in motion by an act of God, rather than on the orders of the President of the United States. But by not blaming Johnson for the war, he could avoid blaming those among his closest and longest-standing political comrades who were supporting the slaughter bloodshed unleashed. He could continue to view them as good socialists with whom he differed on peripheral issues such as how best to end the war. In his response to the central issue of the 1960s, Michael let pass the chance of a lifetime to make a democratic socialist perspective relevant to the hundreds of thousands of Americans who supported the anti-war movement. Meanwhile, Dissent editor Irving Howe, the other most prominent U.S. social democrat, long opposed the demand for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam and was generally derisive of the New Left, and prominent Black Socialist Party member Bayard Rustin acted as a hatchetman for Hubert Humphrey at the Chicago Democratic Convention while demonstrators and McCarthy delegates alike were being beaten by Chicago police. All this was duly noted and loomed large for the generation of 1968. Disgust with social democracy was only reinforced when activists looked beyond Vietnam. French socialists, while in power, had conducted the colonial war in Algeria, complete with torture. The Harold Wilson-led Labour Party government in Britain backed U.S. Vietnam policy despite its misgivings. Social democrats worldwide were among the most vocal supporters of Zionism and opponents of Palestinian self-determination. In the U.S., this led to virulent attacks on SNCC in 1967 after its newsletter published an article supporting the Palestinian side in the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War. In that context, it seemed only natural to identify with the tendency that had fought against similar social democratic backwardness during an earlier imperialist bloodletting. Likewise, it seemed sensible to utilize the framework that communism offered, of revolution versus reformist, of internationalism versus social chauvinism, in order to understand the nature of this bitter split among socialists. Even more significant, communist-led movements and states in the Third World seemed to be imperialism's most consistent and effective opponents. Vietnam, Cuba, and China were the lodestars. The Vietnamese were in the forefront, facing genocide but defeating foreign invaders arms in hand. Cuba's defiance of the behemoth just 90 miles away and Che's selfless effort to bring revolution to other parts of Latin America inspired admiration even beyond the radical ranks. A 1968 opinion poll revealed that more college students identified with Che Guevara, 20%, than with any of the 1968 presidential candidates. China, meanwhile, was the most populous nation on earth, and its 1949 revolution had altered the world political map. Its attraction for new generation activists dates especially from the beginning of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in 1966, and China's post-1967 claims that it was Vietnam's firmest supporter. The Cultural Revolution was pivotal because it seemed to promise a more democratic and creative kind of socialism than that of the USSR. Officially, it called for ordinary people to rise up, participate in political life, and criticize officials who wielded power, even if they were leading communist officials. And Cultural Revolution doctrine claimed that socialism would be built mainly through moral and ideological transformations, not economic development. For U.S. young people rebelling against alienation and consumerism, this approach seemed totally on target, and only later would many become aware of the gap between the Cultural Revolution's claims and its bitter reality. Likewise with China's rhetoric about all-out support for Vietnam. From 1967 on, Chinese public statements referred to their country as Vietnam's rear area. In 1970, China hosted the summit meeting which officially launched a united front of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian revolutionaries against the U.S., and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai personally attended the meeting to express China's solidarity. Ideologically, the Communist Party of China, CPC, put itself forward as a new center for the world revolutionary movement, in a way that the Cubans and Vietnamese parties did not, and promoted itself as the shining example and prime champion of liberation movements waged by peoples of color all over the world. And at least until Nixon visited China in 1972, Western establishment ideologues promoted a mirror image of the Chinese argument, painting China as the most dangerous advocate of revolution on the planet. Race, class, and capitalism. The second main factor pushing activists toward Marxism was the way the fight against racism was unfolding. After battering legal segregation and winning formal voting rights in 1964 to 1965, veterans of the civil rights movement turned their attention to battles for economic equality and political empowerment. This brought the African American movement into direct confrontation with the country's underlying economic structure of power. Issues concerning the segmented structure of the labor market and the disproportionate concentration of African Americans in low-wage sectors moved to the center of their concerns. The pivotal question of class, both the class structure of U.S. society as a whole as well as class differences within the African American community, came to the fore. Many activists, and not just black activists, still look skeptically on Marxism's capacity to shed light on the cultural and psychological dimensions of racism or the unique experience of African Americans. But in targeting the interconnection between class exploitation and racial oppression, Marxism had more to offer than any other framework. Likewise, Marxism offered a powerful optic through which to analyze the increasingly apparent links between the anti-racist struggle in the U.S. and anti-imperialist struggles worldwide. Marxism provided the underpinnings for one of the most influential frameworks for analyzing the special oppression of U.S. peoples of color during this period, the view that these communities, especially African Americans and Chicanos, constituted internal colonies. Again, it was the Leninist tradition that gave the most weight to anti-racist struggles. It had far more to offer theoretically and a far richer practical history in this field than social democracy, and once more actions taken by the Cubans, Chinese, and other Third World communists sealed the case. When Fidel Castro first visited New York in 1960 to speak at the UN, he refused to stay at a downtown hotel and instead based himself in Harlem, where he held a well-publicized meeting at the Teresa Hotel with Malcolm X. Shortly thereafter, Cuba gave sanctuary to Robert F. Williams when he was forced to flee the U.S., and throughout the 1960s and 1970s gave honor, refuge, and a political platform to dozens of other black revolutionaries. China also was home to Robert Williams for some years, and in 1963 and again in 1968 Mao Zedong issued personal statements supporting the African-American freedom struggle and linking it to the worldwide anti-imperialist struggle. Another factor moving many toward Marxism was the late 60s outpouring of militancy and even occasional expressions of radicalism within organized labor. The early New Left had viewed U.S. trade unionism as accepting, if not actually supporting, racial inequality in the workplace. The bulk of the trade union leadership lined up behind Washington's war in Vietnam, initially carrying a large portion of the rank and file with it. Through most of the 1960s, dissenting voices, mainly from a few surviving left-led unions like the West Coast Longshoremen ILW, the United Electrical Workers and Hospital Workers Union 1199, were overpowered by the conservative bloc headed by AFL-CIO President George Meany. It is therefore no surprise that the New Left was strongly influenced by C. Wright Mill's warning against adopting a labor metaphysics and by Herbert Marcuse's arguments in One-Dimensional Man that the working class had become a conservative force. But in the late 1960s changes were afoot. Many have already been referred to: workers and students shutting down France in May 1968, the 1969 to 1970 strike wave, the insurgency among black auto workers and the United Farm Workers strike and boycott, the new combativity among young white workers, and the post-Cambodia split in labor officialdom over Vietnam. In addition, opinion polls made it increasingly clear that workers and the poor were proportionately far more opposed to the war in Vietnam than the more privileged classes. This had always been the case, but many student activists only began to notice it in 1968, and while student protest ebbed at the more elite universities after 1970, anti-war and other demonstrations spread further, if less spectacularly, at community colleges and high schools with higher percentages of working-class youth. All this was absorbed by young activists who were trying to identify potentially radical social forces powerful enough to make a bid for political power. One incident captures the changing reality and the radical reaction to it, perhaps better than any other. On June 7, 1971, a month after anti-war protesters had tried to shut down Washington, D.C. with massive civil disobedience, a group of New York City municipal employees went on strike. Among them were the workers who operated the drawbridges leading to Manhattan. When they walked off their jobs, they left 28 of the 29 bridges locked in an open position. In response, The Guardian wrote, "A few thousand striking workers did what 15,000 demonstrators had failed to accomplish in Washington a few weeks before: immobilize all traffic in and out of the city." This image of workers shutting down the country's largest city captured the imagination of thousands of young radicals. More than a few put their copies of C. Wright Mills and Herbert Marcuse into storage and began to look with fresh eyes at the Communist Manifesto, the clash of Marxist generations. Still, belief in the revolutionary agency of the working class, so central to classical Marxism, took root less strongly among the generation of 1968 than the anti-racist and anti-imperialist strains of the Marxian framework. This was one reason why there was such a break between the aspiring communists of the late 1960s and most of the communists whose outlook was forged in the 1930s and 1940s. For the most part, the old left had embraced what could be described as a trade union pro-Soviet Marxism-Leninism, while the 60s generation by and large adopted a third world liberation Marxism-Leninism. Though the two generations used the same Marxist phrases and texts, they frequently talked right past each other. Indeed, the gap was so large that many on both sides could not even recognize militants from the other generation as part of what they considered the communist movement. This breach was expressed in numerous conflicts between most 1968 revolutionaries and pro-Soviet mainstream communism. Most young radicals rejected Soviet society as a desirable socialist model. This was partly because, along with everyone else in the U.S., they had long been bombarded with negative portrayals of Soviet life, but it also stemmed from indictments of Soviet society from critics on the left. And even more important than whatever picture young radicals formed of Soviet domestic realities was their perception of the USSR's role in international politics. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia was a watershed. The use of tanks to suppress the Czech experiment in socialism with a human face seemed conclusive evidence that the USSR was as repressive, militaristic, and disrespectful of national self-determination as the US. Reinforcing this opinion was the Soviets' seemingly half-hearted support of national liberation movements. Moscow seemed far more interested in pursuing peaceful coexistence, détente, with Washington than in backing revolution. Indeed, it appeared that the US and USSR often tried to cooperate in attempts to keep hotspots from exploding into revolutionary transformations. The young generation's attention was riveted on Southeast Asia, and it was appalled by Soviet policy in Cambodia. Following a March 1970 coup in which right-wing General Lon Nol overthrew the neutralist government of King Sihanouk, the USSR gave formal recognition to the Lon Nol regime instead of to the coalition between Sihanouk and the Cambodian communists that quickly formed to overthrow it. This new liberation front was allied with the South Vietnamese revolutionaries, but it wasn't until October 1973, when it was clear that the Lon Nol regime was doomed, that Moscow shifted its recognition to the Cambodian insurgents. The Soviets argued that détente would put some restraints on US actions and provide a more favorable climate for left movements in the Third World. Such reasoning didn't carry much weight with young activists who were haunted by the level of violence Washington was inflicting on those who challenged its domination. Diplomatic attempts to convince Washington to accept peaceful coexistence seemed futile at best and downright dishonest at worst. It appeared that imperialism could be stopped only by powerful revolutionary movements taking up armed struggle, and what they needed from the socialist world was militant support, not advice to cool it while deals were struck between Washington and Moscow. While Soviet support for Third World revolutions was indeed less than all out, the young radicals' view of détente was one-sided. It all but completely overlooked the pivotal matter of nuclear weaponry and the significance of the Soviets' achievement of strategic nuclear parity with the US during the late 1960s. Prevention of nuclear war had to be a key objective of any serious anti-imperialist movement, and the Soviet nuclear parity was a major deterrent to Washington's use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam or elsewhere. US policymakers were distressed by the Soviet achievement, while on the other side of the barricades the leadership of the Vietnamese liberation struggle recognized its vital importance. Whatever their disappointments with aspects of Soviet policy, the Vietnamese communists never shared the cavalier attitude toward the use of nuclear weapons and negative view of détente that characterized the Chinese Party's outlook. These differences, however, were not apparent to young U.S. activists in 1968 to 1973. They had little appreciation of the dilemmas that faced a Soviet leadership that knew their country was always the prime target of a massive U.S. nuclear arsenal. And with the Vietnam War raging, they didn't appreciate the importance of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and focused instead on the frontline role of national liberation movements and armed struggle. The unimpressive character of the Communist Party USA, CPUSA, was also an important factor for young radicals. In the 1930s, the party had anchored a powerful radical current, and when many new leftists turned to Marxism, they began to appreciate or even romanticize the CP's earlier contributions, for example, the direct action of the CO sit-down strikes in the auto industry. But since then the CP had been battered by McCarthyisms and decimated by bitter internal struggles in the wake of Nikita Khrushchev's revelations about Stalin's crimes at the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party in 1956. By 1960 the party had been stabilized under the leadership of Gus Hall, but its membership was down to about 5,000 from a 1940s peak of 50,000 plus, and its mass influence had been reduced at least as sharply. Even so, it constituted the largest U.S. socialist organization and maintained the largest membership of black activists. It would have been an uphill battle for the CPUSA to regain the central role in the progressive movement it had attained in the 1930s. However, the party persisted in pursuing policies that guaranteed that it would not make it halfway up the slope. For starters, the CPUSA was among the most rigid communist parties in the world in its defense of every detail of Soviet policy. Unwavering support for the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia was the most embarrassing example, but the generation of 1968 also found the CP's approach to domestic politics wanting. The CPUSA was intensely hostile to all expressions of African-American radical nationalism, from Malcolm X to the late SNCC and early Black Panther leaders, and this hostility alienated young militants of all colors. the CPUSA attacked the New Left for petty bourgeois radicalism and insisted on the centrality of the trade unions to left strategy even at a time when other social sectors were driving the progressive movements forward. This position translated into the CP's valuing connections with a layer of labor officialdom over aggressive efforts to build the anti-war or anti-racist movements from below, leading to numerous clashes with young activists. The CPUSA, moreover, was very cautious about raising radical ideas, and it was culturally conservative at a time when most young radicals were inclined toward audacity and cultural experimentation. The CPUSA's negative stance toward the new generation was well summarized by Peggy Dennis, a longtime party activist who was also the widow of pre-Gus Hall CPUSA head Eugene Dennis. Throughout the 1960s decade, the current party leadership placed the organization in opposition to and in isolation from practically every new form of struggle that erupted in the ghettos, on the campuses, and in the streets. Blinded by the inexistence of the new rhetoric of the black and white youth militants and by the sometimes erroneous and often strongly anarchist ideas in their ranks, the party leadership proved incapable of understanding this new movement and the deep-going social crisis it engendered. The party leadership slowly modified its opposition under the impact of the struggle waged inside the party, and finally adopted a condescending posture of concern for the young black and white resistance fighters as misguided victims of repression, still denying them the decisive catalyst role for struggle these young people were throughout the decade. Despite its rhetoric favoring coalition and unity, the current party leadership has taken the party backward into a perminous 1930-like sectarianism. It exacerbates rifts between itself and the various levels of possible coalition allies. It gloats over disarray within the left, and sees itself in competition with any and all socialist searchings not contained within the party itself. Given such a stance, it is hardly surprising that the bulk of the new radical generation decided to take their energy elsewhere. Like almost every other existing left organization, the CPUSA did grow somewhat amid the ferment of the 60s. Scores of talented young people joined, appreciating the party's history of struggle and sense of the long haul. And at the beginning of the 1970s, the CPUSA led an ultimately successful campaign to free imprisoned party member Angela Davis, charged with supplying weapons used in an unsuccessful attempt by Jonathan Jackson to free his brother, soul-dead brother author George Jackson, led to the biggest expansion in the CPUSA's ranks and influence in decades. It's also true that not every reason young radicals rejected the CPUSA was a good one. Some did hold the anti-working class prejudices the party criticized, while others shared the society's knee-jerk anti-communism and directed it toward the CPUSA. Many simply regarded the CP as composed of old stuffed shirts. Nor does it follow at all that the CPUSA's misguided policies stemmed from a revisionist abandonment of Marxism-Leninism, as the new communist movement came to believe. But the key point is that the CPUSA failed to engage the new radical generation as a partner in struggle, refused to entertain the notion that it had things to learn as well as to teach, defended Soviet actions that were backward if not indefensible, and walled itself off from the new movements in sectarian complacency. Thus, the most experienced socialist group in the country missed the chance to connect itself to the new generation, with negative consequences for all concerned. Trotskyism's bid falls short. Trotskyism, which originated as an anti-Stalinist left opposition in the 1920s, did relatively better than pro-Soviet communism in attracting young radicals. Trotskyins offered an insightful critique of the way Soviet society and policy had developed under Stalin and his successors, and staked a claim to being Lenin's true heirs. The main U.S. Trotskyist organization, the Socialist Workers' Party, was one of the first socialist groups to try to develop a relationship with Malcolm X and to publish his speeches in its press. Above all, the SWP threw itself into the anti-Vietnam War movement and played a central role in the series of coalitions that sponsored the large national marches of 1967 to 1972. The SWP and its youth organization, the Young Socialist Alliance, grew substantially during the 1960s and early 1970s, like the CP, recruiting a layer of talented activists. But in contrast to the CPUSA, the influx of 60s militants qualitatively changed the SWP's character, with individuals from the new generation given central leadership posts by the late 1960s and fully taking the reins of power in the 1970s. Still, several features of Trotskyism made it unattractive for most 60s activists. First, U.S. Trotskyism, much more than its European counterparts, was intensely hostile to the Vietnamese and other national liberation movements, The SWP pilloried their leaderships for basing their strategies on long-term cross-class alliances and a two-stage revolutionary process, a national democratic stage followed by a socialist stage. Trotskyist doctrine regarded such multiclasses blocs or fronts, and especially theories of two-stage revolution, as Stalinist betrayals of working-class interests. Going even further, SWP doctrine held that communist parties with origins in the Stalinist movement were incapable of consciously leading anti-capitalist revolts and characterized the Vietnamese, Chinese, and other such parties as counter-revolutionary. To most young activists, such positions seemed not just criticism from the sidelines, but backward and national chauvinist. Second, the SWP's tactics in the anti-war movement included a number of costly negatives. Its insistence on single-issue demonstrations contrasted with efforts to explicitly link anti-racist demands to anti-war activities, and the SWP rebuffed all initiatives aimed at cohering any kind of radical anti-imperialist current outside the SWP itself. In practical terms, this latter stance translated especially into a marked antipathy to SDS. SWP did not denounce that organization or the broader New Left with nearly as much vehemence as the CPUSA, but like the CP did not try to work within or develop close ties with the largest radical student organization of the period. This was a strategic mistake of the first order, and contrasted sharply with the entry into SDS of the Maoist Progressive Labour Party, discussed at length in the next chapter. The SWP was also unable to translate its early enthusiasm for Malcolm X into an ongoing relationship with revolutionary nationalism or to distinguish itself in the fight against racism. Again, Trotskyism's hostility to cross-class alignments was at the root of the problem. People of color freedom movements in the 1960s and 1970s universally assumed a cross-class character and made progress largely to the degree that such alliances was strengthened and consolidated. The SWP's shortcomings were widely noted even by Trotskyists in other countries. Tariq Ali, a Trotskyist of Pakistani origin who was one of the leaders of the anti-Vietnam War movement in Britain, offered this critique of the SWP leadership. They struck me as apparatchiks pure and simple, obsessed with inter-party manipulations, factional intrigue, and an unbelievable sectarian attitude. The SDS had won over the cream of American youth in the late 60s. The youth adjunct of the Socialist Workers' Party had recruited the leftovers. Even these proved to be too independent as far as the new leadership was concerned, and most of the 68 levy did not last long in their ranks. If I had been in Berkeley rather than Oxford, I would not have joined this international. Finally, Trotskyism was vulnerable even in its strongest area, its critique of Soviet society and foreign policy. After all, what was the point of adopting Trotskyism's speculations in this area when far more powerful players seemed to be creating an alternative to the Soviet model on the ground? Trotskyism offered an elegant theoretical framework, but in the real world Cuba was embarked on a daring and innovative effort to build socialism. Che had given his life for internationalism. Vietnam was demonstrating that the power of the people is greater than the man's technology, and China was experimenting with a seemingly grassroots-based cultural revolution. The communists leading these explorations were hostile to Trotskyism, charging it with being a purist doctrine attractive to intellectuals but unable to deal with the day-to-day struggles of workers and the oppressed. They indicted Trotskyism for having no relationship to actual revolutions except that of critic or outright opponent. Certainly there was a good deal of slander thrown in, much of it originating from what the Trotskyists accurately called the Stalin school of falsification. But few 60s activists rejected Trotskyism mainly because they bought into Stalinist historiography. Rather, they were reacting to direct experiences with U.S. Trotskyism and to the gulf between Trotskyism and the forces actually driving revolution forward worldwide, a third world-based international in the making. Despite these various shortcomings, both pro-Soviet communism and Trotskyism would have attracted more young radicals had there been no alternative pole. But the dynamic revolutionary parties in the Third World seemed to offer a new international in the making. Cuba's independent position, for example, carried great weight. Though allied with the USSR since the early 1960s, the Cuban party never simply echoed Soviet positions and frequently differed sharply with Moscow. Especially between 1966 and spring 1968, Cuba stressed the need for armed struggle and hemispheric revolution, in contrast to Moscow's emphasis on peaceful, parliamentary activity and détente. What's more, Havana actively organized for its views, convening the Tricontinental Congress of 100 revolutionary organizations from around the world in January 1966. The gathering, which included numerous groups not recognized by Moscow as members of the communist movement, founded the Organization of Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, OSPAL, and issued its own regular publication, Tricontinental Magazine. During the ensuing period, the Cubans openly criticized several pro-Moscow communist parties and the Soviet Party itself, and encouraged the development of guerrilla movements. Che Guevara went to Bolivia to participate personally in this internationalist effort, and in 1967 the Cubans published his message to the Tricontinental with its widely quoted call to create 2-3 many-vitents. The distance between the Cuban and Soviet parties closed somewhat in late 1968, but the Cubans continued to pursue distinct policies in domestic and foreign affairs, and to develop ties with young U.S. revolutionaries who were outside of or even unfriendly to the Moscow-recognized CPUSA. The Chinese Communist Party was even more ambitious in presenting an alternative to the USSR. The Sino-Soviet split burst into the open in 1960 to 1963, and in a public and comprehensive series of open polemics the CPC accused the CPSU of abandoning revolutionary principles, revisionism. In contrast, the CPC put itself forward as the contemporary guardian of Lenin's legacy. Lenin had built the original Communist International by doing battle with revisionists who refused to oppose World War I and advocated electoral politics rather armed insurrection. The CPC claimed to be fighting modern revisionism today. Against the Soviets' stress on achieving peaceful coexistence between capitalist and socialist countries and the possibility of peaceful transition to socialism, the Chinese emphasized the inherent capitalist tendencies toward war, gave prime weight to national liberation struggles, and endorsed militant, extra-legal tactics and armed struggle. The CPC also implied that the Chinese were leading the worldwide upsurge of peoples of color against white domination, not only against the US and Europe, but also against efforts by the white Soviets to dictate policy to revolutionaries of color. Filled with enthusiasm for a united Third World-led revolutionary movement, the generation of 1968 overlooked numerous complexities. For instance, Beijing cut off its package of trade aid to Havana in 1966, and Cuba accused China as well as the USSR of not practicing true Marxism-Leninism and of interfering in Cuba's internal affairs. The Vietnamese consistently called for an end to the Sino-Soviet split and refused to side with either power. Neither the Cuban or Vietnamese parties regarded the CPSU as revisionist. These differences will be discussed in later chapters. For the moment, the key point is that such disputes, even when young U.S. activists were aware of them, seemed secondary to the picture of a concerted Third World surge against Western domination. The overriding conclusion among young radicals was that there were clear parallels between Lenin's break with the opportunists of his day and the division between partisans of armed struggle, China, Cuba, and Vietnam, and opponents of it, the USSR and the communist parties it dominated. Even further, there seemed to be parallels between both of those experiences and the day-to-day fights in the U.S. between aspiring revolutionaries and the more cautious old left, whether social democratic or pro-Soviet communist. The biggest upheaval of the decade in another advanced capitalist country, the events of May 1968 in France, drove this point home. While millions of French students and workers took to the barricades and engaged in passionate imaginations of a radically different society, the pro-Soviet Communist Party of France did its best to blunt the upsurge's radical edge. The Guardian captured the overwhelming sentiment. The Communist Party of France was unable to respond as a revolutionary vanguard after 35 years of parliamentary politics. The party initially condemned the student uprising, as did the Soviet Union. After French workers began to join the rebellion on their own, the CP, through the General Confederation of Labor, moved in with a call for a one-day strike. The CP clearly sought to control the spontaneous uprising and channel it into a parliamentary and trade union direction, seeking a popular front government and improved wages and working conditions for the workers. Workers were warned against joining the students. It is difficult to separate the French CP response from international matters. The Soviet Union, at first referring to the students as hooligans, is not displeased with President de Gaulle. Poland, too, of the few communist governments who have discussed the issue openly, applauded the de Gaulle foreign policy, saying France has faithful friends who do not want to see her in chaos. The Leninist Party in the 1905-1917 analogy. The experience of U.S. activists was far less intense than that of their French counterparts, but the same basic elements were present. Many decided that revolutionary mass action was desirable and possible, and that they needed to find a new vehicle for leading that mass action on to victory. That quest led to the central question of the party, Of all the practices associated with communism, today the vanguard Leninist party is probably more discredited than any other. For current-day activists, it seems almost inconceivable that the project of party building could appeal to large numbers of thoughtful, independent-minded youth immersed in vibrant mass struggles. Leninism's call for a party of a new type is seen as top-down, undemocratic, elitist, a rationale for irrelevant sex, if not justification for brutal dictatorial rule. But surprising as it may seem, for a host of 1960s activists, the Leninist Party was regarded as quite the opposite, as a weapon for democracy, a vehicle for combating elitism, a structure facilitating grassroots empowerment. Above all, constructing a Leninist vanguard seemed to offer the most effective route to mobilizing millions for social revolution. Many 1968-era radicals were won to party building in part by theoretical argument. For all the reasons discussed so far, they turned to Marxism and became convinced that Leninism embodied Marxism's revolutionary vision and anti-imperialist strategy. They therefore read Lenin and adopted his theory of the vanguard party as part of the package, but they never would have done so if this theory had not resonated with their own experiences. Leninism's claim that the vanguard party is a far more effective and liberating radical force than the looser organizations of democratic socialism or grassroots participatory democracy corresponded to the realities that had shaped 1968 radicalism. Most 1960s veterans had gone through battles in which an initially small core of activists had achieved leadership of broad masses and outdistanced others who started out with far more influence. Time and again, tiny bands of militants who articulated demands that spoke to the aspirations of the dispossessed were able to move mountains. This was a key lesson drawn from the way a virtual handful of SNCC organizers and homegrown leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer had been able to build the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and defy intense pressure to trade principles for political expediency. It described the trajectory of the watershed Berkeley free speech movement, when a core of civil rights activists with Mario Savio at the pivot prevailed over both established moderate student leaders and the university. This was the radicals' experience when the besieged SD's leadership stood firm against the red baiting of its 1965 anti-Vietnam War demonstration and broke the back of the long-standing communist exclusion policy. For a generation shaped by such experiences, and hundreds like them on a smaller scale, the notion of a vanguard winning leadership of the working class if it is united, disciplined, and willing to do battle with opportunists didn't seem top-down or undemocratic. Far from being a formula for imposing unpopular policies on a passive constituency, Leninism seemed to capture the dynamic, living way in which movements develop in the course of struggle against powerful adversaries. Activists also identified with Lenin's observation about how chaotic grassroots protest often outstrips the strategy and organization of revolutionaries. The key exposition of Lenin's theory of the vanguard party, What is to be done, hinges much of its argument on this point. According to Lenin, one of the central reasons to build a party of professional activists is that otherwise the work of the revolutionaries can never keep pace with the spontaneous resistance of the oppressed. Lenin recognized that there is an ebb and flow in the class struggle, and that during most periods the oppressed classes do not take an active part in politics, but his focus was on the vital question of what will happen when they do. Will there be a well-organized body of revolutionaries prepared to explain the nature of the capitalist system, draw new militants into leadership of the movement, and provide the means to protect them from police repression? Or will each generation of activists have to reinvent revolutionary organization for themselves? Lenin's arguments on this point seem to reach across the decades to directly address all those who had scrambled to find their way in the ferment of the 60s. Moreover, Lenin's theory of the party was an incentive to action. Activists gobbled up histories of the Russian Revolution and learned how the Bolshevik Party started as a small group spending inordinate amounts of time on ideological polemics. They waded through the pages that described how this party had been carefully molded into a united and disciplined organization, and how this training allowed the Bolsheviks to stand firm against World War I and in favor of a worker and peasant revolution, while other initially more influential forces wavered. And they learned how this stance enabled the Bolsheviks to grow spectacularly during the mass upheavals of 1917, achieve majority support in the Russian working class, and finally lead the seizure of state power. All this seemed directly applicable to the situation in the late 1960s US, which 1968 radicals began to analyze through the prism of the 1905-1917 model. The 1905 revolution in Russia had failed, but it had demonstrated the potential of masses in motion and served as an intense learning experience for the emerging working class and the still small core of Russian Marxists. After this dress rehearsal for revolution, the Bolsheviks led by Lenin had nurtured their party carefully and even learned to survive underground. A decade later, when the Russian population rose up against the carnage of World War I, the Bolsheviks were in position to lead the popular uprising for peace and political power. The extent of social upheaval in the 1960s, and the obvious fact that it was not led by a strong left party, made it fairly easy for activists to think of 1968 to 1973 as the American 1905. Most of them realized that there would be periods of ebb ahead, though in their youthful exuberance some couldn't imagine an ebb lasting as long as the 12 years between 1905 and 1917. But this only lent more urgency to the conclusion that it was necessary to follow Lenin, quickly organize a revolutionary party, and get ready for the next round of mass upheaval just down the road. The 1905-1917 analogy also provided a framework for analyzing the 1968 generation's relationship to the old left. The communists of the 1930s had acquitted themselves well, most thought, but their revolutionary resolve faded during the long ebb and repression of the late 1940s and 1950s. Thus they were unable to play the revolutionary role required when the new movements of the 1960s took off. Some young activists felt sorry for the old left, others were angry at them, but almost all were sure that their generation would do better. U.S. activists were not alone in looking at the 60s through the ebb and flow 1905-1917 prism. In almost all the advanced capitalist countries, a youth-based current that saw itself to the left of mainstream communism adopted this point of view. Not surprisingly, France topped the list, where many agreed with Daniel Singer's analysis of the decisive question confronting the post-1968 left. The storm of 1968 took everybody by surprise. Though nobody can predict the length of the interlude, it is quite safe to forecast another upheaval. What the revolutionary groups have not yet ensured is that history will not repeat itself. There are still no political forces on the horizon capable of carrying the movement to its logical conclusion, of turning a rebellion, a rising, into a revolution. Leninism and democracy. The young radicals who turned to Leninism saw no contradiction between a party that could lead an assault on the state and one that was internally democratic. Virtually all New Left veterans had experience in democratic organizations with wide-ranging discussion, open membership, and non-hierarchic informal structures. Often these organizations had come to be dominated by a handful of leaders, sometimes selected more by the media than by the membership. With the rank and file excluded from actual decision-making, almost invariably control was exercised by the individuals who had the most education, money, social confidence, or other benefits stemming from class, race, and/or gender privilege. And strong New Left sentiment against any kind of formal structure had deprived organizations of any mechanisms for ensuring leadership accountability. The result was a handful of strong personalities manipulating things under the guise of consensus and anti-bureaucracy. A scathing critique of such practices as manifested in the women's liberation movement can be found in The Tyranny of Structuressless, a widely read 1970 pamphlet by Doreen. On top of all this, late 60s activists had bitter experience with liberals and social democrats who themselves engaged in thoroughly undemocratic practices while preaching against the evils of Leninism. One of SDS's formative moments came when the organization's social democratic parent organization had locked SDS leaders out of their office after the SDS convention that drafted the Port Huron Statement in 1962. And after the snub to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964 and the backroom deal nomination of Hubert Humphrey in 1968, it hardly seemed that the Democratic Party touted by liberals had much democratic content at all. No, liberal democracy, social democracy, and New Left participatory democracy all seemed infected with the very anti-democratic practices and elitism they accused Leninism of embodying. In contrast, the tighter, more accountable structure offered by Leninism appeared to provide tools to combat precisely those problems. Instead of manipulation by media-chosen celebrity leaders, there would be accountability from an elected central committee. Instead of domination by privileged class elements, strict internal policies would make sure people from working-class and oppressed minority backgrounds could exercise power. Instead of allowing individuals who talked a lot but didn't do any work to dominate deliberations, high membership standards would exclude the blowhards and value the self-sacrificing hard worker. The Leninist proposal for building a tight cadre corps gained additional support as activists became more aware of the extent of state repression, infiltration, and disruption. It wasn't just a matter of reading about government spy operations and the like. Many had direct personal experience with police informants, misinformation campaigns, local Red Squad harassment, and COINTELPRO dirty tricks, and worse. Public open groups were exceedingly vulnerable to such tactics. People who were serious about radical politics and about their responsibilities to ordinary people taking up protest activities saw a need for organizations capable of resisting the government on this front. Similarly, the ongoing rebellion underway within the armed forces and the prisons deeply impacted young organizers. Broadened public organizing among GIs and prisoners was an absolutely indispensable part of waging this rebellion. But the nature of prisons and the military meant that secret and conspiratorial organizational forms were required as well. Those who denounced Leninism had little to offer here. To the contrary, it was almost exclusively the communist tradition that historically had organized among soldiers and behind bars, indeed right within the Nazi concentration camps. Against such a backdrop, many aspiring revolutionaries concluded that building a new Leninist vanguard was not just a good idea, but a historical necessity.